Hello, everybody. Good morning if you are in California. Good afternoon if you are in Europe. Good night if you are in Asia or in Australia. This is a collective book with 10 contributions with 10 leading experts on education problems. We are very grateful to our university, the University of Lisbon, and my research center, CEMAP, for helping setting up and organizing this event. And I'm very grateful to Natalie Wexler, the education journalist who agreed to moderate this debate. Natalie is the author of the bestseller, The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of Americans' Broken System and How to Fix It. She wrote other books, namely The Writing Revolution with Judith Hochman. Thank you very much, Natalie, for moderating this event. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nuno, both for the invitation and for that very nice introduction. And I'm really delighted to be moderating this discussion, which I think promises to be truly thought-provoking. We have with us today experts on education policy from 7 of the 10 countries covered in the book, Improving a Country's Education. We have experts from England, Estonia, Finland, Poland, Portugal, Spain, and the United States. Unfortunately, because of time differences, as Nuno alluded to, and other logistical problems, we could not be joined by the authors from Australia, Chile, and Taiwan. But of course, their contributions are in the book, and they are well worth reading. So let me confess that at first I was a little hesitant to accept this invitation, not because of any doubts about this project in particular, but because generally relying on test data to draw conclusions about which education policies work can be tricky. And that's perhaps especially true when the data come from different countries, because the context can really vary so much. You know, there have been, for example, complaints about so-called edu-tourists who will flock to a country that has scored high on international tests and then sees on some aspect of its education system that seems to be responsible for that success, without considering a number of things. One, that the culture or governmental structure may be very different from their own, that the education policy they've seized on may also be present in other countries that have not experienced success, or that high test scores could have resulted from policies that were in effect years before, but have since changed. So I have shared this skepticism, especially after doing research as a journalist into an education system that I assumed I knew well, that of my own country, the United States, and realizing that it was actually a lot more complicated than I had thought. How can I or anyone not very familiar with another country's system draw any meaningful conclusions about what works to improve education based on that other country's test data? But today's event and the book on which it is based provides an answer. Professor Nuno Crato has had the brilliant idea of asking people who are experts in their own country's education systems to connect their deep knowledge to the PISA data for their countries. And we now have enough data from that test and others, almost 20 years worth in the case of PISA, to make it possible to trace trends over time and also to try to connect those trends to policy changes. So we can now ask, for example, why some countries have been more successful than others at raising overall achievement, and why some previously low-performing countries have improved their rankings, and also why some high performers have slipped. And against the background of generally widening gaps between students at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, we can try to analyze the very important question of why some countries have done much better than others at improving educational equity, and if it's possible to replicate that success elsewhere. Now, while we may not arrive at definitive answers to these questions today, but given the high level of expertise and knowledge assembled here, I am sure we're going to have an illuminating discussion. And now I'm going to turn things back over to Nuno for a brief presentation of some of the key points in the book before we begin our discussion with the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I'm going to review very briefly the first chapter of the book, which is my introduction to the book. Of course, it's my introduction. The opinions are my own, but I try to reflect and to draw on the conclusions and lessons that the authors have written in their chapters. So what's in this book? This book is published soon after PISA 2018 results release. People don't realize sometimes that the results take a long time to be released. They were released about a year ago, less than a year ago. We did this book in a record time. It's published now and it's open access. PISA 2018 is not only important by itself, but it's the largest international large-scale assessment to date. And we have a detailed analysis of 10 countries by leading experts. If you browse through the book, you will be as pleased and as I'm honored to realize the high level of expertise of all the authors. So we have 10 countries from all over the world, as Natalie pointed out. We have a background chapter explaining PISA and international large-scale assessments, so that could be helpful for people who are not that familiar with what's on PISA. And we have this introductory chapter. Well, I'll start by saying that we don't have good news in general. PISA has 3 areas: reading, math, and sciences, and they have an initial standardization, which is a Gaussian distribution with mean 500 and standard deviation 100. But now the OECD mean scores have slipped, and as you can see, countries are declining slightly but consistently after 2009. So this is a worrisome fact. What does it mean? It's something that some authors will discuss or have discussed in their chapters. Particularly worrisome is the increase in share of low performers. If we look at low performers as described by PISA, it has a precise meaning according to PISA. You see that OECD countries started by having in 2009 this share of low performers, which is around 20%, and it's already a lot. But instead of improving, things are worse now at this moment. And if you look at the European Union, you see the same trend. So you see that things, instead of improving, have become worse. This is very worrisome indeed. However, there are other positive impacts from PISA, TEAMS, and other large-scale assessments. TEAMS, by the way, is going to be out next week, so we are going to look forward to see what lessons can be drawn from the results. The first positive thing about PISA and TEAMS and other assessments is that they have shaken most of the countries, and some countries that were not paying attention to their results started paying more attention to their results and to students' knowledge and skills. Some try to change by giving more attention to curriculum, to assessment, to helping students, and others trying to switch to an elusive competence-based curriculum, not understanding, I think, in my point of view, that if you want to improve competence, that means if you want to improve application skills, you have to pay attention to knowledge and to structured knowledge as a curriculum can provide. We have the time delay factor, which makes very difficult, as Natalie said, very difficult to draw conclusions from PISA results. It's really, we have to disentangle causes from many other changes. And sometimes things take a long time to have an effect. Look, for instance, at Finland. Finland, high standards for teachers started in '79. Arto has a chapter in which he discusses this and other questions about Finland. And this took a long time to have an effect. And when we look at nowadays Finland, who, by the way, is having some problems now, the results are not improving, not by the contrary. Nowadays Finland and nowadays policy in Finland is not the same that improved Finland results many years ago. However, some changes have an immediate impact. If you eliminate exams, if you change the public perception of standards rigor, as it happened in Portugal, as João Marocco discusses in his chapter, we can have immediate effects, and actually PISA results in Portugal stalled. Again, what's happening now in terms of policy in Portugal is not what drove the increase in results in Portugal from 2003 to 2015. So we can't be fooled just looking what people say that is happening now. We have to think about what changed the countries and what are the deep causes. Another issue that's very controversial is money. We have here discussed money. Money matters sometimes. And when we think about investing in education, people think immediately more money for education, pay better teachers, more resources for school, lots of things around this that may be important, but are not all. And just look at this graph from 2015 PISA, where you see that results that you can see in the y-axis, results here, and you can see here the investment, and this is in PPP, so this is in purchasing power parity per student cumulative spending, and you see that at this area, countries that have the spending is correlated with the results of the countries. But when we arrive at this level, things flatten out and the things are not as related. For some reason, the new PISA from 2015 doesn't have exactly the same graph, but it has a very similar graph, now with a different functional regression. But we see the same idea. And if you look, for instance, at Poland and Austria, just think that Poland and Austria has the double of investment in students, of expenditure in the education that Poland. And Poland is way ahead. Poland has done something right, for sure. And there are some issues about what's happening now in Austria. Much more striking is Estonia, this comparison, Estonia and Luxembourg. Luxembourg has something like 3 times per student in purchasing power parity. This is not in terms of what. No. So taking into account the difference of the countries, about 3 times the investment, and look that Luxembourg is not having results as good as Estonia. And we are all looking to Estonia now. So why? Why is it happening? Well, you have to read the book. You have to see the discussion that's in the book. Australian chapter discusses the resources at distribution level, which is another approach that is very interesting. So not at the macro level, but at the local level. Now, another issue discussed in this book is high performance in equity, that are actually non-conflicting goals, although people think always of these things, or many people think as conflicting goals. Well, I'm going to start by some shocking statement and some shocking question. Are all inequality gap reductions positive? Well, most people would say, or many people would say yes. Let me show you a graph from this book. And we have here boys and girls. We are comparing them. And we have some negative tax reduction inequity. Look, the gap reduction is very notable here, from 19 to 7 points, the gap reduction. But why? Because boys here have slipped. They have much worse results now. So I call this a negative gap reduction. But there are positive gap reductions, like this one from the same country, where we see a gap reduction, but we see everybody improving at the same time. So we have to distinguish, when we are looking at equity, we have to distinguish what we are doing. We specifically discussed the issue in Australia, England, Chile, Finland, Portugal, Taiwan, so this is discussed. And our recommendation, or my recommendation, is we have to assist low performance, don't lower standards. So don't think that by lowering standards, you have an equity reduction. No, you have to assist low performers. Grade retention is another thing that is well discussed in this book. And some systems try to avoid evaluation purportedly to reduce inequalities. But we have a couple of data in this book. For instance, in Spain, we have 40% of reductions of retentions. So we have really a very high level of retentions that represent 8% of the education expenditure according to same computations. But so we could think, well, we should avoid retentions. No. The issue is not only whether a low-performing student improves or not by repeating the grade, which is the way things are usually discussed, but in my point of view, the issue is much vaster. It's much wider. The issue is, will the system as a whole improve if everybody is told that repetition will never happen, no matter what level a given student attains? That's the question. And my answer to it is no. The system doesn't improve if we tell everybody that repetition will never happen. So the focus of excellence should be sustained with special support for struggling students, and not the other way around. Exams and assessment is something that is discussed also in this book. Estonia, for instance. Estonia is the new star, new European star in education. Estonia tests in grades 3 and 6, has exams at grades 9 and 12. Poland, this chapter discusses how exams create incentives for teachers and students, and how evaluation is associated with autonomy. Because we can do a mistake. The mistake is to have more autonomy in schools or just to have more evaluation, and the two things should go apart. Portugal, introduction of exams were followed by higher PISA scores. So PISA scores improved each time there was an exam, and João Moroco in his chapter discusses this, and now that some exams were abolished, we see that things have stalled. Let's see what's going to happen in teams next week. Spain, lack of assessment is associated with inequality. You have to read this chapter to understand it. Curriculum and pedagogy. This is also something that we can infer from this book, or we discussed in this book. If you look at PISA data, PISA studies point to effectiveness of direct teaching, but we are always hearing the opposite. We are always hearing that according to PISA, we should have inquiry-based teaching exclusively, we should have student-centered teaching exclusively, and look at what PISA data says. PISA data says exactly the opposite. It says that direct teaching is effective. And this happens, this is data that's reproduced in this book and discussed in this book. So you have to read the book, you have to look at the graphs carefully. Estonia has less centered approaches now, has a balance between tradition and innovation, which I think we all appreciate. We all appreciate that we improve education, but we don't throw away the baby with the water. And Estonia also highlights a very demanding curriculum, high quality examinations built directly on the curriculum. So the two things are tied in a fortunate way. The England chapter by Tim Oates talked about how abhorring memorization has harmed students. Poland tells us to be cautious about so-called 21st century skills. And my conclusion is this: if you want students to be proficient in applications, that means if you want students to be proficient in what competence is, in what PISA measures, don't concentrate on what PISA measures, but concentrate on basic knowledge, concentrate on a structured curriculum. So lessons on how to improve an education from my point of view, and I know that many of authors in this book share this point of view, are to concentrate on the fundamentals. First lesson, you have to have a demanding curriculum, rich in knowledge content. We have to have assessment. We have to support all students without lowering standards. And finally, education policies need to be judged by students' results rather than policy intentions. This is a big mistake that many times people do. Thank you very much. Natalie, back to you.
Well, thank you, Nuno, for that overview. And we're going to delve a little more deeply into some of the points that you made. I'd like to start by going back to one of those cautions about interpreting PISA results, which has to do with the time lag between policy changes and test scores on PISA and other assessments. And I'd like to start with Tim Oates in England. I know that he has written about this phenomenon. And Tim, I'm wondering, Finland's been mentioned and Portugal's been mentioned. If you could maybe go more deeply into those examples or offer another example of a situation where observers have reached conclusions based on PISA scores that really fail to take account of that time lag.
Well, thanks very much, Natalie. And you mentioned educational tourism. And what I will focus on Finland for a minute. And what I'm going to say is not critical of Finland. It's critical of the way people have approached interpreting Finland. And I want that to be very, very clear. So, yeah, the small airports all over Finland were very, very busy in 2001 and 2002, carrying educational researchers into the country. And the Finns, being very polite, only mentioned after they'd left, why are they asking about how our schools are now? Why weren't they asking about how our schools were 20 years ago? Because the kids in Pisa were 15 years of age. And they didn't suddenly immediately reach the heights of performance in Pisa overnight. No. The system was configured in a particular way. And it's only by looking at the totality of the experience of those 15-year-olds and the system, how the system was configured when they entered the compulsory schooling, can you actually answer effectively the question, what resulted in high performance? But I'm afraid there's a bit of a sting in the tail for Finland, because that was about time lags and educational tourism. But you also mentioned culture, because Finland was it top in PISA in 2000? Well, it was first in reading, and it was much lower in science and mathematics. Its total score took it into first place. But I'm afraid the first literacy policy in Finland was quite early, because it was in the 17th century, when pastors visited every home to check that parents were teaching their children to read. Now, when you look at this over an appropriate timescale, goodness me, that timescale, you suddenly realize that the high performance in reading was probably more an outcome of the culture of the country than the performance of the education system. So Bill Schmidt from Michigan is probably entirely right when he says, shock horror, Finland was never top of PISA. So this is how sensitively we have to approach the kind of data that we get from transnational surveys, taking time lag and culture into account.
Well, thank you. That's helpful. And I think it would make sense now, since we've been talking about Finland, to turn to Arto Ahonen from Finland, maybe to comment further on the time lag issue. And also generally, while Finland still does outperform most other countries, whether or not it was ever really at the top, it still does outperform most countries. But at the same time, its scores and its ranking have been in decline since 2006, and the gap between high and low scores has grown. And so I guess I'd like to hear your response. I mean, so some of these educational tourists have seen certain policies in Finland that have been in place in recent years and concluded that they were responsible for Finland's early success. But it's also been suggested that success was due to a fairly highly centralized system and a more teacher-directed style of pedagogy that was in place until the mid-1990s, and that maybe that is what Finland's earlier success was attributable to. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Do you agree?
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, Tim, for this really thoughtful article of yours and your speech. So there are so many thoughtful questions, and I don't know where to start from. But it's like if you think of this, how much effect like curriculum and curriculum change can have on countries' educational outcomes. So I think it's must. We have to think about Finland's school system has been reformed only since 1970s. So our school system we are running now is more than 40 years old now. So we haven't had any like big fundamental changes in our systems. And then we have maybe curriculum changes in every 10 years. And if you think about a curriculum change that we have had during PISA studies, so we had this that you mentioned, 95 from 2004, one curriculum in effect, and then the second one from that 2004 until 16. So, and all these curriculum changes come to effect gradually. So they don't come to effect in like overnight. And when Finnish teachers are like professionals, independent professionals, and they decide what kind of a pedagogical approach they practice in their classes, what materials they use. Only the curriculum maybe gives the teachers the content. Okay, you need to, and the objectives. You need to approach or practice these kind of skills and try to get the students learn these objectives. But they don't. Curriculum doesn't say, okay, you have to use these methods or you have to apply these materials in your classes. Teachers have the free choice of their own pedagogy. Even in school-based, they can differ. In one school, teacher can adopt that kind of pedagogical approach, and then another class they have totally different, and they form kind of maybe even the school principal, the headmaster can. There's very little they can affect on the one teacher's work at their own classrooms. Mm-hmm. So we come into a question. Okay, how much these curriculum changes and the school system reforms affect on the actual teaching and the outcomes? I think you have to go into like teacher training. And how the teachers are trained, and then all these like trajectories where they come from. It's okay. They might come. When I was trained as a teacher in the mid-90s, constructivism approached it in teacher training. Before that, it was more behavioristic kind of approach when all the teachers before me were taught. So when I entered workforce, maybe at the beginning of or end of 90s, then okay, I might have applied some of my own thoughts in constructivistic or student-centered teaching, but still the mainstream of the schooling is more like a directed approach. And when these younger generation enter workforce, they may have some changes at the school cultures, but still, I think it's kind of a mixture of these both. And I can't recognize that there's any point where kind of the system or the teaching practices change from a teacher-centered to student-centered or vice versa. So it's like I don't know, it isn't an answer, but it's at least some thoughts of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's obviously, as with so many things in education, very complex, and there's no one thing you can point to. And I do think, I agree, teacher training is enormously important, and that's certainly true in the United States. And I'd like to, I think that sort of segues naturally to turning to Estonia, which, as Nuno mentioned, is sort of like the new Finland in some ways, and there may be some educational tourists going there soon. So I'd like to turn to Gunda Tira from Estonia. and ask you about this. First of all, the country is at or near the top on the most recent PISA 2018 for all 3 subjects. And it's done much better than most countries in narrowing those gaps based on socioeconomic status. And I am sure, again, there are complex reasons for all of that. But as Nuno also mentioned, the teachers in Estonia, perhaps because of their training or the culture, have tended to adopt a more teacher-directed style of pedagogy. But a few years ago, in 2014, the government adopted some new policies, and that included a shift to more student-centered learning. And I would wonder if you have any thoughts on why the government would make those changes if the previous approach appears to have been so successful, and if there is any concern that moving away from that more teacher-directed approach to learning could have a negative effect on equity, especially in light of findings from cognitive science that a more teacher-directed approach works best for students who may not have as much background knowledge of a topic, and that may characterize a lot of students from the lower socioeconomic stratum. So if Gunda could respond to that, that would be great.
I would like to start with the fact that Estonia has been already quite popular amongst the education tourists, and we have received, until the pandemic time, we have received quite a lot of people. And I'm not afraid that we are taking tourists away from Finland, but the more serious tourists, they come to Estonia and Finland, so they join the trip. And we are not so worried about the tourists, because actually PISA has put Estonia on the world map. Estonia is not the world's best known country anyway. It's just 1.4 million people. So we're thankful to PISA for that. If you had a lot of questions, but if I talk about being at the top on a league table in such a prestigious study as PISA, it doesn't mean that you don't have any problems. I mean, the government, the politicians change, and as a government, as a new politician, you need to have somewhere to go. So you need to look for places which need to be improved. And if you, and this is what happened in 2014. Estonia was looking for some kind of areas that we should go further on, and we created a lifelong learning strategy 2020. And in that strategy, we pointed the points, for example, about teacher education, and also about paying more attention to the students in that approach. If you have such a good strategy document, this is a good note for the policymakers. You can apply for all kinds of fundings and get lots of money. And so if money comes into education, education is improving. So we have managed to get quite forward with it. But what I wanted to say is that this student-centered and teacher-centered is kind of what Arto said, that it's not exactly black and white. It's not like you use one and then you can't use the other one. We all agree that direct teaching is not really the ideal version. We want to have both. And so so the Estonian school, similarly to Finnish school, is quite autonomous. So even if the government produces such a strategic document and says this is what we suggest, so it's still up to the teacher to decide which method would be better for that particular group of students. And the thing is that the teachers in Estonia are quite the average age is 49. So it's the tendency that they are maybe more of the older generation, and so they teach the way that they have that they know that works. So in that sense, what I'm trying to write in my chapter is that probably the best approach is to have a balance between the old, or between the student and between the teacher approach. But if you talk about the equity, then I think that the student group that would suffer the most from a very centered student approach are the boys, because the teenage boys, especially on the lower achieving end, they need much more support and direction from somebody who tells them what exactly to do.
That's interesting, and we'll get into that gender gap, which is another kind of gap in PISA results. I hope a little bit later, but yes, certainly, there's got to be a balance between teacher-directed and student-centered, and teachers need to know how to strike that balance for their particular group of students. I think that is something maybe we can all agree on. But sticking with that idea of equity, I'd like to turn now to Maciej Jakubowski from Poland. I noticed that Poland has made significant progress overall since 2000, when PISA began, as measured by PISA. But it's interesting that low achieving students and high achievers have improved at different time periods. Low achieving students made progress mostly between 2000 and 2009, and then high achievers between 2009 and 2018. And I wonder if you have any theories that might explain why those two groups improved at those different times, and whether it could be related again to curriculum reforms that took place in Poland in 2008 and 2009. And again, that made the curriculum less prescriptive. And whether you think there's a way to boost learning as of course we would like to do, for every student, both groups of students simultaneously.
Thank you. So many questions. So first of all, it's true. I mean, we have very strong evidence that the first wave of reforms, which started in 1999, they mostly served the low achieving students, and mainly those who would otherwise, without their structural reform, go to vocational schools. So the reform basically extended general education, comprehensive education to all students. And of course, intuitively, that benefited those students who would otherwise go to vocational education, which we know where the quality of teaching mathematics, language is very low. So we actually have a PISA research on PISA, looking at this subgroup, nice quasi-experimental research, which I summarize in the book, showing that the benefits were mainly for this group. We also revolutionized the system at that time. So we not only created these new schools to which students would go and have one additional year of general education with new curriculum and with teachers who would now more intensively go to professional training. And we saw and we see from PISA data that the largest change was in the differences between schools. So before the reform, we have one of the largest differences between schools. So basically for students, your achievement would very strongly depend on whether to which school you would get to. And that was really a dramatic and a huge bad outcome for the Polish education system. And that changed dramatically. We actually now have differences between schools at the level of Scandinavian countries, at the level of Estonia, but we are a much bigger country with much larger socioeconomic inequalities. So that's a huge achievement. So that was a structural change in the structure of the system. But we also changed the curriculum, but step by step. In the beginning, it was less prescriptive, and then in 2009 it was just a core curriculum which gives you a description of outcomes you have to achieve. We also introduced examinations, so standardized assessments, which a little bit control what are the student outcomes and create a pressure on teachers. But this is a system I call the soft accountability, which is very different from what you have in US in many states. I mean, we publish these results, but these results are published at the school level. So there is no blaming game for individual teachers, for example. But everyone in a school knows who is teaching which students and what are the results. So there is a very strong social pressure on teachers to perform well on these exams. And we also did a lot in later reforms to align curriculum with the examinations. So what you expect in the curriculum is actually tested on examinations. So of course, it might have a negative effect on narrowing curriculum, but on the other hand, when you really examine the most important things, we are quite sure that now teachers focus on those. Those are really delivered in schools, and we see very good outcomes based on that. Thank you.
Okay, well, yes, thank you. And you mentioned testing and the role of testing, which is actually the next topic I'd like to turn to. And as with many things, including curriculum, it can be pretty complex. It's not always just tests make things better or tests make things worse. It can depend on the kind of tests. But I'd like, and yes, and the consequences, et cetera. I'd like to turn to João Marocco from Portugal now to talk about the role of testing there a little bit. And in the case of Portugal, PISA scores rose between 2000 and 2015, and that was true for low performers in particular as well. Their scores rose. And it appears that the introduction of national exams in math and Portuguese was a factor. But at the same time, as Maciej mentioned, we have high stakes reading and math tests in the United States that have not had a similar effect in boosting overall achievement and in improving equity. And in the United States, the tests, like the passages on reading tests, are not tied to the content of the curriculum. And also the tests generally, they may have consequences for schools and for teachers, but not for students themselves. So I'm wondering if you could speak to whether the exams in Portugal are different in those respects. And if so, if you think that helps explain the difference in outcomes in the two countries.
Hi, Natalie. Yeah, very interesting question. In my personal opinion, yes. I think that the major policy change that explains the Portuguese evolution on PISA was the introduction of the grade 9 exam, high-stake exam for mathematics and reading Portuguese language. And this is a high-stake exam that is quite different from the standardized test industry that you have in the United States. In Portugal, high-stake exams are high stakes really for the student. So the final grade of the student is a weighted average of the internal score that he gets from his or her teacher and the final score that he gets from the national exam. And so, you know, if the student doesn't get a minimum weight on average, he's going to be retained for another year on the same grade. So see, this is really high stakes for the students. The students feel that, you know, they have to do well in the exam, otherwise they can flunk the year and be retained. This is really high stakes for the families, because of course the families don't want their kids to be retained. This is somehow high stakes for the teachers, because of course, you know, you don't want your teachers to be, your students to be retained. And this is also a little bit high stakes for the schools. But our high stakes for the schools and for the teachers, like in Poland, they are kind of soft high stakes, because, you know, you don't really get the results from a single teacher. You get the results from single schools, and actually it's more the media, the newspapers that, you know, pay big attention to what was the ranking of the school in the national exams, and then also the families, then the schools itself, and then the teachers within the schools. And it's quite different from the situation that you have in the States, because in the States people talk about the testing burn. Students are burned out by all this standardized testing. They feel that, you know, the tests don't have really any important consequences on their final grades. On the other way, they really have consequences on promoting the teachers and getting more resources to schools. So while the teachers are, you know, pushing for the students to do well, the students don't really care. And they even refuse to do the tests, as you know, probably better than myself. And if they don't do the test, they don't really put the effort in the test that a Portuguese student or a Polish student will put in a high-stake exam, where he knows that it could be flunked in that year if he doesn't get a good grade in the exam. So yes, in my perspective, you know, having high-stake exams with consequences mainly for the student, because it's the student that, you know, gets the test and gets the results in the test. It's not the teacher of course, the teacher has the role of teaching the student. And that's also very interesting in Portugal, because, with the introduction of the high-stake exams, first on grade 9, and then we saw a huge jump in PISA scores, but also in grade 4, and we also saw a good jump in teens mathematics scores for grade 4 students, but not for science. And in my personal perspective, and I have discussed this with colleagues all over my country, in my personal perspective, it was the introduction of grade 4 exams for mathematics and Portuguese that really brought the Portuguese students for grade 4 above the team's average. But we don't have national exams for science, for example. That's another domain that teams assesses, and that's also another domain that PISA assesses. And in science, we saw a drop. So no standardized high-stake exams, we saw drops. High-stake standardized exams, and we see a rise in the scores. Having said that, another difference from our system is that before, and it changed in the last government, we had high-stake exams for grades 4, 6, 9, and 12. And for grade 12, the score of the exams will be very important in granting access to the university for those students. But so what I'm going to say next is that it's not because of you testing every day or every grade that the system is improving. I mean, if you break a bone, it's not by taking RX every month or every couple of days that your bone will heal faster. But you have to take RX because, doctors need to know if your bone is healing okay or not. So contrary to the United States, where you have standardized tests for pretty much all the grades, it doesn't really matter to have, in my personal opinion, exams, high-stake tests for every grade. But by the end of cycles, it's really important to have this type of accountability of students and also of teachers. Because, if a teacher knows that the subject of the curriculum is going to show up in the national exam, then he's going to make all the efforts to teach that subject. And if he knows that, there is no national exam, so there is no really pressure on the teacher side to teach the curriculum. And of course, sometimes our teacher says, well, we should be teaching students, not curriculum. But of course, teaching for the exam is teaching the curriculum. And so if you have curriculums that are, well constructed, then you have to put pressure or incentive, the way you want to put it, on teachers to teach that curriculum. And the national high-stake exams do that also.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, that does sort of relate to the point that kind of all begins with curriculum. And I would just comment that in the United States, there is burnout, and I think some students don't care about the tests because they don't have consequences for them. But I have been in schools, especially where there are 8 and 9-year-olds who hear very, deeply and get very anxious about the tests. The problem is that the tests, not being rooted in any particular content, appear to test sort of general reading comprehension skills, and that's what teachers try to focus on. But as cognitive science has told us, you can't really teach those skills directly without also building knowledge by focusing on content. And I think that is one big difference between tests in the United States and tests in countries like Portugal, where the content of the test is actually tied to the content of the curriculum. But turning now to Spain, which also, is sort of the flip side of this. This is a question for Montse Gomendio in Spain. And Montse, you argue in your chapter that in Spain, the lack of national tests has led to inequity, especially by resulting in, as Nuno referred to, a large number of students who were forced to repeat a grade. João mentioned in Portugal, the tests identify those kids and they repeat a grade. But in Spain, you have the situation where they're not being identified, but they can't do the grade level work, so they have to repeat a grade. I'd like you to just comment on the link between testing and that grade retention situation, and how unique Spain is in this respect. Do other decentralized countries have regional tests instead of national tests? And generally, what kind of student evaluations do take place in Spain, and what education reforms have been targeted to that issue of testing?
Thank you very much, Natalie. So, yeah, Spain has followed a very different strategy from Portugal. And I do think it's a very unique case in the sense that the fear about tests leading to teacher blaming, that someone mentioned before, or tests leading to discrimination against students from disadvantaged backgrounds, because they are expected to have lower levels of performance, has led to the abolition of tests. Now, Spain is a decentralized system, but it's decentralized only in terms of management. So the regions are in charge of managing the schools and so on, but it's central government that decides the rules of the game, the structure of the education system, and so on. So it's basically the decision made by central government about whether there are going to be national evaluations or whether there are going to be regional evaluations, and you know, what kind of rules should they follow. So for many decades, the decision by central government has been that there can be no evaluations at the end of each educational stage, because they don't want these evaluations to have any consequences for students. There can only be evaluations if regions wish to implement them at intermediary grades within each educational stage, but they can only include a sample of students. So they can never be linked to individual students, they can never be linked to teachers, they can never be linked to schools. So basically, just a diagnostic sample, that's the way it's called in Spain, that only includes a sample of students and can never really give information about individual students, teachers, or schools. So as I said, this was meant to avoid tests having a negative impact among students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So what's happened in Spain in the last decades, because this has been going on for quite a long time, before PISA started in 2000. So what's been happening is that because we don't have evaluations in primary, then it's very difficult for teachers and for the system to identify students who are struggling. So there are no compensatory measures to support those students, to give them the additional support that they need in order to catch up with the rest of the students. Because there are no evaluations at the end of each educational stage, then there are no common targets. So teachers don't know what those targets are. So basically within each school and each classroom, teachers set different targets. And this leads to huge regional differences. So even though Spanish students get a national degree at the end of lower secondary and at the end of upper secondary, there are no national standards. So whether they get the degree or not depends on the continuous evaluation by teachers within schools. Now, what happens with students that are struggling when they start school is that because they cannot be identified and they cannot be supported, they start lagging further and further and further behind until they reach the point, mainly when they enter secondary, lower secondary, where they are completely lost. They can't follow what is being taught in the classroom, and they are complete outsiders, basically. So they start repeating grades. Now, PISA does identify that in Spain, grade repetition is very high. It's been between 30 and 40% of the students repeating grades, with, again, huge regional disparities. But it doesn't link grade repetition to any specific cause, like lack of examinations, lack of evaluations, and lack of support for struggling students. And it also doesn't make the link, which I think it's really worrying, between grade repetition and early school leaving. So what we find is that those students that repeat a grade are much more likely to drop out of school. In the case of Spain, early school leaving has been very high for a long time, around 30% of the students dropping out of school. So this is a major inequity, because most of the students were dropping out of school by the age of 16 when compulsory education ends, and they were not even getting the degree for lower education. So the point that I'm trying to make in the chapter is that sometimes policies like evaluations are not implemented because of the fears of discrimination against students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, fears about blaming the teachers, and so on. But the problem is that the absence of these evaluations leads to the worst form inequality that's possible in the education system, which is basically excluding those students that are struggling and that fall so far behind that there's no way that they can catch up from dropping out of the system.
Yeah. Well, yes, and that's fascinating. And we, you know, in the United States, which I'm going to turn to next on this, partly on tests and partly on curriculum and pedagogy, we do have national tests essentially, although states can choose what tests to give. But at the same time, we also have this situation of some students reaching higher grade levels being far behind where they should be. So it's a complicated question. And I would like to turn now to Eric Hanishek in the United States. And as you note, you know, the United States has undertaken a number of different education reform measures in recent decades, including test-based accountability, but also, and some would say, lots and lots of testing, but its ranking on PISA has been essentially stagnant, and the gaps between high performers and low performers, as you acknowledge, remain large, both on our national tests and on PISA. And given that nothing that we've tried seems to have worked, I wonder if you feel it would make sense for policymakers, for reformers, to start examining the question of what is being taught in American classrooms, the curriculum, and what pedagogical methods are generally being employed, and whether there's something we can do there that might make a difference.
Well, thank you, Natalie. I think that the first thing I have to do is give a disclaimer, because I'm probably the only education researcher who's never been to Helsinki, and I have yet to get to Estonia. So I'm giving you my views from the US, and views that you know very well yourself, Natalie. Going back to Tim Oates's introduction, the time lag issue in the United States is different than trying to relate the Finnish performance to current policies or old policies. And it's different because US performance, the levels have been constant for roughly half a century, as we measured consistently with our national tests, and that the PISA confirms. More than that, the gaps between high socioeconomic status families and low socioeconomic status families have not changed in 50 years. And this is remarkable in the US because we've had debates. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty and rightfully said the way to deal with poverty is to deal with structural issues, and that's the human capital and skills of the population. So he put in place a lot of attempts to try to narrow gaps. And the remarkable thing is that they haven't narrowed. Now, coming to the question of curriculum, I guess I have a slightly different view on this. I want to go back to the very last sentence that Nuno made in his introduction, and that is that we have to look at results and not intentions. And I view curriculum and standards as our intentions, but that doesn't really identify whether we're getting what we intend to get out of this. And to me, that comes back in the US to worrying about the quality of the teachers and whether they are adding or not. We know that parents are really important, but it's the schools that we've given the job to sort of top up what the parents are doing and to level out the socioeconomic differences. And in the US, we've had lots of debates. Part of the debates have been, as other people in the book have mentioned, about whether we have too much testing or whether we've used the test appropriately and so forth. We're about ready to go into an experiment with that in the United States, because essentially no tests were given last spring with the pandemic. And we have already declared that we will not give our normal national tests next year in 2021. And I think that will add to a growing anti-test movement in the United States. To me, this is a huge mistake because, as mentioned in the case of Spain and other places, how do you know if you're improving or who needs improvement if you don't measure it? You wouldn't ever run a business without knowing whether you're making a profit or not, or whether your expenses are too high for your revenues. So I think that we've looked back at a series of policies that have been designed at intentions. We have a huge set of policies from the federal government and from the state governments. We're a very decentralized system and states make lots of decisions, but we've had lots of well-intended policies that we haven't linked to the results. And in fact, we haven't got the results. And so I come back to the thing I take away from this is that we have to pay more attention to whether policies in schools are working. The other final thing that I would say is that listening to my colleagues who wrote other chapters in the book, what you see is that there's lots of idiosyncrasies in exactly what policies might work in what situations and so forth. I'm a firm believer that we don't try to declare the right policy, but in fact, look at whether the policies are producing results. And that's the only way that we're going to improve. And so I'll leave it there with my US view.
Okay, well, I think one thing maybe we can take away from the test is that whatever we have been trying hasn't been working. And so, of course, getting rid of the test would not guarantee success. It's kind of like saying, if you don't like to know about the spread of the coronavirus, you could stop testing, but that certainly won't stop the spread of the coronavirus. So I'm with you on the need for tests to show us where we are, if nothing else.
Exactly.
So we have now, I think, all 7 of our chapter authors have had a chance to answer one question, and we do have about, I think, 15 more minutes. So I may not get to everybody else again on a second round, but I do have some additional questions to ask. I might just check at this point to see if we do have questions from those in the audience. And if so, maybe we could take a couple of those. No, we don't. Okay, so I will continue then. Following up on, well, my particular focus has been on curriculum, and I'd like now to return to João in Portugal to follow up on an idea that Nuno raised in his introduction to the book, and he is a former Minister of Education in Portugal. He observes that there, of course, are numerous factors in educational success, but that, as he puts it, everything starts with the curriculum. And he adds that the curriculum has to set clear and ambitious goals and define the foundational knowledge that students need in order to develop skills. And I wonder, João, if you could comment on, to what extent do you think Portugal's improvement on PISA and perhaps other measures has stemmed from having that kind of a curriculum?
Yeah, so I really agree with that statement from Nuno. Everything really starts with the curriculum. And in Portugal, I think there are 2 major effects of the international large-scale assessment, not only PISA, but also TIMSS, is that, after the first participation in Portugal, both in TIMSS 95 and in PISA 2000, the results were very poor. And, policymakers start asking why. And one of the reasons was because our curriculum was very weak. So we went to a period of, new democracy, that people, start thinking about all the different philosophies for teaching and for learning. And so the curriculum was left behind. And so when we compare the results on PISA 2000 and TIMSS 1995, we really saw that there was really a lack in our Portuguese national curriculum for mathematics and science and reading. And so this was a really nice and strong effect of the international large-scale assessments that allow us to improve our curriculum, not only in terms of contents, of the syllabus that the teacher needs to teach, but also on teaching methods, teaching times for the different subjects, and of course accountability, and of course assessment. So yeah, you really need a strong curriculum, and Teams does that very well. Both Teams grade 4, grade 8, and Teams Advanced, they have these curriculum match analysis where they compare the different curriculums from the different countries with the curriculum that is proposed by the assessments for Teams. And so if you look at those type of difference between countries in the curriculum, you can see what are the strengths of curriculums from some countries versus some other. But you really have to have a clear definition of what are the contents that the teachers will be teaching, what should be the methodologies that the teachers should be using. I know that in Finland is quite different and it works quite well. And in Spain, it's also quite different. The curriculum is not, that focus on how to teach the subjects. And in Spain, it does not that well. And it also has to do a lot with, the expectations that the teachers have and the training that the teachers have. And so you really need to, if you're starting with a fresh teacher, someone that is starting teaching, you really need to give them strong guidance to how to teach, what to teach, what goals should the students achieve, what are the objectives of teaching that curriculum. And so, yeah, I do believe that, having a strong curriculum, not only in terms of contents, but also in terms of the structural aspects of the curriculum, how to teach, how many hours to teach, how to assess, that's really important for any country to improve.
Yeah. And you mentioned the connection between curriculum and teacher quality, and how a good curriculum can, especially with a novice teacher, can really help turn a good teacher into a great teacher. I mean, I've certainly seen that and heard that from teachers in this country, that curriculum has helped them, good curriculum has helped them improve their teaching. But that brings me now to a question I'd like to ask Maciej again. In Poland, you observed that as a result of the education reforms in Poland in 1999, teacher quality improved, and you say through two things: the introduction of a core curriculum and increased teacher autonomy. And I know, especially like here in the United States, teachers often feel that curriculum is a limit on their autonomy. So I'm curious, and sometimes resist curriculum because they feel it limits their choice of what to teach. So I'm curious, how did Poland manage to combine a core curriculum and increased teacher autonomy? And how did that combination lead to better teacher quality?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think it depends from which point you start. I mean, we started with a very prescriptive curriculum, which, overloaded with things teachers have to do every day in the classroom. So there was little or no autonomy to teachers of what they can do in the classroom. Then we basically gave them more autonomy, more freedom in, for example, choosing textbooks and then teaching methods. And then in 2008, around 2008, we introduced core curriculum, and that was a kind of revolution, because we told teachers that actually we prescribe them, describe the learning outcomes that we want them to achieve, but we told them, okay, now how you achieve that, even how you distribute that learning over time, over several grades, it's up to you. You decide. And I think saying that that the full curriculum decisions should be at the level of a school is a little bit too much. I don't believe that at the local level you have the expertise to develop a very good curriculum. I mean, that's not necessary. But what is very important is to give the complete freedom over teaching methods, over how you do it in the classroom, really. Because teachers know better, and frankly speaking, no one can control them, what they do. I remember that from communist times, what teachers were doing in the classroom after the doors were closed, right? But it's not the only thing. I think my previous speakers emphasize that it has to be an orchestrated effort. So it's not only autonomy in curriculum. We also invested a lot in teachers, right? We gave them a professional, we asked them actually to continue professional professional training. We introduced new professional levels. We have all teachers in Poland having master degrees now and continuing professional development. That, of course, it's very important. I talk about assessments already, but also when you look at the Polish system, when you look at Estonia, I was actually in Estonia, so I saw their classrooms, and they're very similar. They're actually kind of traditional, and I think the whole point also in Polish school and in Estonian school is that we still focus on knowledge. We have these discussions with parents saying you don't need knowledge, you don't need facts because you can Google them. So we talk to teachers, and teachers have to explain parents that this is very important. This is the foundation for critical thinking and all these things. We actually train teachers in that now, and we explain them findings from cognitive science. And teachers said, this is something I know. This is something I know deeply in my heart, but they were telling me to teach differently. But we didn't follow this fashion, and I think now it's a second wave when actually teachers learn about findings from cognitive science, and we will keep good learning.
Well, that's very encouraging. I mean, there is a very nascent effort here in the United States to introduce teachers to the principles of cognitive science, and it's, I think, hugely, hugely important. We are almost out of time, but I would like to just finish up on what may be an optimistic note and return to Montse in Spain. In your chapter, Montse, you suggested that attempts to introduce innovations into the 2018 PISA and perhaps earlier administrations have actually masked some real improvements, possibly, in both Spain and other countries. And we can certainly hope that's the case. But I wonder if you, in 2 minutes or so, if you might be able to talk generally about how should test designers balance the need for reliability, for the ability to make comparisons over time, and against the need to adapt a test like the PISA to changing conditions.
Sure. So the idea wasn't mine originally. So there are a number of researchers that have compared the results from PISA with the results from Pearls and TIMSS, the 3 major international surveys. And in 2015, they noticed that while in PISA, most countries either declined or remained stagnant, in the same countries in Pearls and TIMSS improved, right? So the question is, why is that happening? And in 2015, PISA implemented some major changes in methodology. So it could be that it's masking the results, or that's the optimistic view, as you say, or it could be that those changes are making the results less reliable. So I was concerned in 2018 because PISA, the OECD withdrew the results for Spain, my country, on reading, the main domain. So I've been investigating why that was the case since I left the OECD. And I think more than trying to adapt to changes in the education system that it has been following since its very beginning in 2000, it has to do with the fact that PISA has grown. It has many more countries. And most of the countries that have started participating in PISA in the last cycle are low and middle income countries that tend to perform poorly in PISA. So PISA, I think, I mean, these are my conclusions from my own investigation, as I said, after I left the OECD, decided that it had to give these countries more information than just saying your score is very low, because what was the point of these countries participating if they were only going to receive bad news? And because people are not aware of the time lag that Timoth mentions, then the very same politicians that decided to join PISA were often blamed for the bad results in PISA. So PISA introduced a number of items from another program, which is PISA for Development. And in some countries like Spain, students seem very confused by those items. So they responded in random ways, and then they continue to do the PISA test according to the levels of performance. This is the reason why PISA decided that the results for Spain were not reliable. And then my concern is that those changes have to do with the ambition that PISA has to expand and to offer something to countries that are performing poorly. And that's fine, as long it doesn't affect the reliability and comparability with previous cycles of the countries that have participated in PISA since the very beginning, which is mostly OECD countries. So yeah, I think it's very important to balance not only the need to evolve well aligned with the way education systems are changing, and at the same time keep a core set of anchor items so that you can always compare with previous cycles, because for most countries, it's not only about comparing the country with others, but knowing whether things have improved after certain policies have been implemented. So comparing with previous cycles is really important. If PISA changes things because new countries have different needs, then it needs to find a way so that other countries can still compare the results with previous cycles and can still compare the results with other countries.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think that strikes a note about a balance, which I think is important, not just in innovations in testing, but in so many things in education. As we've heard, balancing student-centered and teacher-directed learning and all sorts of things. And we've reached pretty much the end of our time. I know I've learned a lot today from all of our distinguished panelists. I want to thank them all. I also want to encourage you, if you're curious to hear more, and if this has piqued your interest in the book, it is available. It's available freely for download, and it's full of even more fascinating things than we have heard today. So please do check it out. And I will now turn this back over to Nuno to close us out.
Oh, thank you very much, Natalie. I just want to thank everybody for participating. Thank you for moderating so well this debate. Thank everybody who was present. I hope that sun now is out in California, because it was night when we start. Rick, and thank you. And thank also the absent authors, because they couldn't be present. Now I think it's 4 a.m. in Australia or something like that. And thank Isaac for supporting this event. And second, Natalie, about downloading the book and discussing the book. Thank you very much.